Hi there, this is Dominic. In this quick video I want to talk to you a little bit about speaking and how it's scored. In some ways the title of the video should tell you everything. It's coherence and fluency. Here's the main point. Most people, when you ask them about how speaking is scored, will mention vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and then fluency. That's not quite right, in fact. You're not scored on fluency, you're scored on fluency and coherence. And what I want to do quickly in this video is talk to you about part 1, what speaking is scored on, part 2, how fluency and coherence operate, what they are, and part 3, very quickly talk you through how you can improve your score by thinking about fluency and coherence in each part of a test. Okay, part 1. Speaking is scored on vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, fluency and coherence. What is fluency? Fluency is many things, but it's really the ability to keep on speaking. It's the ability to say enough, not too much, enough. It's also the ability to speak without pausing, and it's the ability to start speaking immediately. What about coherence? Two separate parts to coherence, related but separate. One is cohesive devices. This should be familiar to you from writing. They're the linking words. In speaking, we use simple linking words mostly, and, but, so, because are easily the most common. And we also have some slightly more advanced ones, more particular to speaking, actually, as I was saying. And if you want to be coherent, you want to use some of those linking words and devices. But it's also something more general. Coherence is the ability to speak so that people can follow your meaning, understand what you're saying. And that's something you want to concentrate on in the test. Not just keep on speaking, but to make sure that the examiner can understand what you're saying. Okay, part 1 of the video complete. Now for part 2. Part 2 is, how do fluency and coherence relate? They're different, but what point I want to make here is, in some ways, they're not just different, they're opposite. What do I mean? Well, to speak fluently, you need to keep on speaking. And if you want to keep on speaking, you can't waste time thinking too much. Your mouth has to keep on moving. Coherence is actually slightly different. Coherence is largely an organisational task. You want to organise what you want to say. But it's not like writing. This is speaking. It's a real-time activity. You don't have time to stop and think. But you need to make time to stop and think. And so fluency, keep speaking, 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 don't think. Coherence, stop, think, pause. And your task in IELTS speaking is to find a way of marrying those two together. To keep speaking and find thinking time. And the way you need to do that is practice, of course, and also develop strategies or approaches for each part of the speaking test. And that's what I want to do briefly now in part 3, talk you through how each part of the test works in relation to fluency and coherence. Part 1 of the test, it should be relatively straightforward, really. In part 1 of the test, you get simple questions. The sort of questions anybody should be able to answer. Where do you live? How often do you go walking? Fluency, where do you live? I live in Bogota. That's not fluent. So to be fluent, you need to expand your answer. Where do you live? I live in Bogota. I've been living there for 10 years now. Before that, I lived in Ohio. I've said one thing, two things, three things. It's a fluent answer. I've said more. Coherence, though, is you need to link those things together. I live in Bogota. I've been living there. That's a linking word, isn't it? I've been lived there for 10 years now. Before that, I lived in Ohio. And again, I link it together. If you want another example, how often do you go walking? Actually, I don't go walking very often because I work in an office and I don't have much time for leisure activities. Fluent, saying more, but also coherent because I'm using and because. I'm linking things together. And the one point I want you to notice about both those two answers is this general approach strategy. Answer the question directly first and then develop it. Don't try and be clever. Direct answer, expanded with reasons, examples, etc. Part 2 of the test is slightly harder, and you'll need slightly different approaches, techniques to be fluent and coherent. In part 2 of the test, you have to speak for 2 minutes. That's a clear fluency problem. You need to find a way of speaking for a longer period of time. But shouldn't be too hard actually, because they help you. They give you 1 minute thinking time beforehand. And actually, I think my best suggestion here is use that thinking time for thinking. Thinking about what you want to say. Don't worry too much about words. Words are just little things. One word makes very little difference. Much more important, I think, is to make sure that you have enough to say before you start speaking. If you do that, you'll be able to keep on speaking. What about coherence? There's a coherence problem here as well, because, put simply, the longer you speak for, the easier it is to get confused. But again, it's not too hard actually here, and the exam helps you again. The question you get is not speak for 2 minutes about this, it's like this. Talk about someone interesting from your childhood. That's the topic. And then it says this. You should say who that person is, 1. How you first met them, 2. 3. What you did together. And 4. Why that person was so interesting. And here is my suggested technique strategy. Don't talk about one thing. Talk about each of those things separately. Speak, pause, speak, pause, speak, pause, speak, pause. If you do that, it's much easier for the examiner to follow. Pausing is an important point, important skill. And actually you can still pause and remain fluent. You just have to pause in the right place. Here, in between each separate little question. And something else. You want to help the examiner further by saying what you're talking about. I'll make this slightly babyish, perhaps oversimple, but you start by saying, I'm going to tell you about this person. This is how I met them. Blah, 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 blah. I'm now going to talk to you about how I first met them. Blah, 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 blah. Now, this is what we did together. Blah, blah, blah. And finally, this is why this person was so interesting. Of course, that's slightly oversimple, and if you want to get higher scores, you need to find more interesting ways to link things together. But you still want to link things together and show the examiner what you're talking about. So, that's part 1, answer directly. Part 2, think and then separate each part. Part 3 of the test, you need a slightly different set of skills and strategies. What's the problem here? This is, I think, the hardest part of the test. Here, you're asked questions where you need to think. Not like part 1, these are thinking questions. How popular is marriage with younger people in your country? You may not know. Here's a fluency problem. You may not have much to say, but you still have to expand your answer. There's a fluency problem. And the coherence problem is this. You need to think. You're not given thinking time like part 2. You're going to be fluent, you're going to start speaking immediately, but you also need to find the thinking time. And I don't really have time to do it here. On my site you'll find different strategies for dealing with these harder speaking questions. But here's the main point I want you to take away here. You need to find a way of organising your answer. A strategy for this type of question. So I'm going to start by talking about this, then that, and perhaps at the end answer the question. And you're doing that because you're thinking about being fluent and also thinking about being coherent. Okay, that's almost all. I just want to finish by going back to the beginning, being coherent, reminding you about the main purpose of this video. When you're studying speaking, don't just think about fluency. Think about being coherent as well, helping people understand what you're saying, linking things together. And if you're smart, and I want you to be smart, study for each different part of a test in a slightly different way, because each part of the test is testing a slightly different speaking skill. Hope that helps. Bye-bye.